We are now recording. We're live. So, all right. Thanks, everyone. I haven't seen everybody online yet, but thanks for participating online. Let's go ahead and get started with roll call.
All right. Either a yay or nay, or if you don't, even a message in the chat box would be great, just so we can get a count soon. Member Bedey.
Here.
Member Melton.
Here.
Member Holmquist.
Here.
Member Morajo. Excuse for now. Member Iverson.
Here.
Member Hertz.
Here.
Member Galt.
He'll be calling in.
Excellent. Excused. Tom McGilvery. Member. Excuse me. Excused now. Member Bott.
Here.
Member Cotton.
Here.
Member Logan.
Here.
Member Ross.
Here.
Member Smith.
Here.
Member Jones.
Here.
Member O'Hare.
His hand is raised. He comes on as the Montana Chamber of Commerce. You got to promote him.
Excellent. Thank you. We'll assume he's here. Member Fern, we just heard from, he has other committee business with the legislature. I believe he will not be attending, is what we heard. Excused. Member Horpedal.
Here.
Member Johnson.
Here.
Member Olkers.
I'm here for week right now.
Member Wiggers.
Here.
Chair Osmundson.
Here.
Mr. Chair.
Okay. Thanks, everyone.
Pardon me,
Excuse me.
Vasika's here. I wasn't called.
Oh, let's see. Did you? Okay, we've got you. Thank you.
Oh, excuse me. I'm sorry. Member Vasika. I'm sorry.
Present.
There we go.
All right. So I'll just ask the members, go ahead and be on mute unless you want to say something. We will try to pay close attention to the screen on if you've got your hand up. So it just might help with feedback. So if you don't mind muting yourselves for now. I just want to take 1 second and kind of go over, I know it's been a couple months since the governor called this task force to order. So I just want to remind ourselves the purpose and kind of the timelines and the report and what's expected of us. So if you would bear with me, I'll just read through this real quick just to remind ourselves. But the task force shall provide the governor with recommendations and strategies for the state of Montana and any political subdivision of the state to reform the property tax system and reduce the burden of property taxes on taxpayers. In developing the recommendations and strategies, the task force shall seek input from Montana citizens, members of the legislature, Montana Association, whose members are impacted by property tax policy, the advisory groups and researchers focused on property tax policy and other appropriate stakeholders as determined by the task force. And then the report is due by August 15th, 2024. Task force shall provide an initial written report to the governor with recommendations and strategies to reform property tax system of the state of Montana and its political subdivisions, including arresting the rate of growth of property taxes, including assessments and fees, as well as alleviating the impact of drastic increases of property appraisals, increasing transparency of property tax bills, making them easier to understand for property taxpayers, and improving customer service in payment schedules for property taxpayers, increasing transparency of the public engagement in public budgeting, increasing public participation in mill levy ballot measures, ensuring property taxes paid by Montana resident homeowners and on Montana long-term rentals reflect well on supporting home ownership and workforce housing, ensuring each Montana child has access to a quality education, and ensuring lower income Montana homeowners who are on a fixed income, and disabled Montana veterans or their surviving spouses are not at risk of losing their homes because of property taxes. I just thought that might be appropriate as we kind of keep going here as we're developing recommendations. I think subcommittees are doing a great job, but I just wanted to refresh our memory one more time. I'd also just briefly like to touch on, and maybe I'll have Ryan go through this if you don't mind, the subcommittee recommendation template. And I know maybe it's a little bit early as you guys are working on some of the recommendations, but I just want to make sure you understand this is a tool out there, and we're going to try and keep a consistent format as we bring these recommendations into this report. So if you want to walk through that a little bit, Ryan.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Yeah, Ryan Evans for the record, Governor's Budget Office. This template might be brand new to everybody. Maybe some of you remember it, which seems way back when now, way earlier in the spring or winter when there's still snow outside. So it's our goal, and this came out of, in full disclosure, the Department of Environmental Quality-led Housing Task Force of the Governor's here, which has worked phenomenal in terms of a reporting back structure. It's pretty simple. People around me can kind of hear it, but just talking through its 5 or 6 main headers, we can certainly make sure that that's distributed back out to the committee members here. It's made so this recommendation formation, now that I guess the good news, and I think we'll probably hear in the subcommittee reports, we're getting down to that point where I think we've culled a fair list and refined a list of what we can now tackle as hopefully formal recommendations coming out of these committees. If not potentially even joint subcommittees at this point where some of these issues might cross. So I guess this is the next phase that we'll be instructing our staff. I know I'll be working with you all on is what ultimately goes into this. The good thing is a lot of the work's already been done. We already have lots and lots of data, lots of great factual graphs that I think at this point really start boiling down some issues into understandable things that I guess our hope is that the recommendations will be based in facts, based on the research, and we've already done a lot. And I'm looking forward to the subcommittee chair reports here. But again, we can talk with you on anything like that. We'll make sure this week another copy gets out. I know I've been giving plugs from in the subcommittees too, so hopefully it's not brand new, but ultimately this is the way that we can refine our information down into what Chair Osmundson just talked about, that report that at this point still seems far away, but it's not. We're almost halfway through this process now. So, but yeah, that's all I had. Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ryan. So I think the format, as you can see in the agenda, we're going to go ahead and just get some reports from the subcommittees. Obviously, we'll start with local government, and then we'll go to education, then tax fairness. And I think it'll roll right into some tools that Department of Revenue has been building and has presented to some of the subcommittees. And so we'll spend a fair amount of time looking at that as well. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Senator Hertz.
Thank you, Chair Osmundson. So since our last full committee meeting, the local gov subcommittee, we met on April 4th and April 15th. And we covered several more topics. As the slide shows, it's everybody was sent out to. I just we've collected and reviewed a lot of different options and data. At this point in time, we haven't come to a conclusion as to which items we may move forward. So that's going to be our next process as we go forward after this full committee meeting, and we meet again, and then we will push forward some recommendations. But so some of the items that we've covered, we looked at the scale of local non-levy revenues and how they're integrated in the budgets, just kind of get an idea what the dollar amount of those numbers were. We also, we talked about the timing of when mill levies and bond levies and other elections should happen. So that's kind of been transferred over to the education subcommittee, and looks like they're taking that task on. So we've kind of taken that off of our plate. We've also obviously looked at items that control property tax growth. So 1510 420 kind of was a topic that we went through and discussed that. We talked about the role of inflation, half the rate of inflation, new taxable property, and how that works in with 1510 420, and actually went through a tool that was presented to us also that was very helpful. We've discussed Senate Bill 511 somewhat. I think we need to probably dig down into that a little bit more if that's something the subcommittee wants to push along further. That was just another option to remind people as to maybe option in place of 1510-420. And then we also talked about how these limitations, whether it's 1510-420, Senate Bill 511, how they might also work in relationship to TIF districts, SID, and also bonded debt limits, and how that all comes into play. So it's a really a big, that's a really a big bucket when you talk about 1510-420 and the overall control of growth. Another item we talked about, we went through the different property tax assistance programs that we have, the PTAP, the veterans programs, et cetera. Discussed about the possibilities that do those need to be reviewed, and looking at raising the thresholds on who qualifies for those. And then they'll also raise the idea of looking at means testing on some of those items also. Most recently, last Thursday, the 18th, we went through the local option sales tax presentation that was provided to us by Jen Hensley. Jen's working with some counties on this issue. For those of us who have been in the legislature, the local option sales tax is something that we've discussed just about every session since I've been there, since 2013. This went into a little more in-depth study, and with the idea of taking that local option tax and giving the local government the allowance then to use it for not only property tax relief, but also to use it to fund other essential services that they may need in their communities also. So with that, we looked at, I did a little more investigating into what was going on with some of our resort taxes. I talked to Whitefish quite a bit, got some of their numbers, shared that a little bit too. And Whitefish basically uses about 25% of their local option, their resort tax, I should say, for property tax relief. And that's providing about a 6 or 7% reduction in property taxes for an individual household. So I know some of our discussion too, not only of the group as a whole, but other individual I've talked to, was if we went down the local option tax road for potential property tax relief, could we tax e-commerce? And so that led us to Alaska, and which does tax e-commerce and has somewhat of a local option tax. So last Friday, Ralph and Megan Moore and myself joined several individuals with the state of Alaska, and they kind of explained to us what was going on up in Alaska and how they are able to capture dollars, e-commerce dollars, through their local option sales tax. I would kind of refer Alaska's local tax as more like a general statewide sales tax, because it's very broad-based. In fact, they tax groceries on it in most communities. Some of the very small outlying communities have opted out of that, but it's pretty much a broad-based sales tax. But each community, whether it's a city or a borough, which is a borough is just similar to our counties, has to vote on whether they want to have that tax come into play. And it's interesting to note that Anchorage and Fairbanks, the two largest cities, which make up the vast majority of population in Alaska, has elected not to implement a sales tax. The voters have never approved it. So this is primarily out in those local communities. But getting back to the issue of e-commerce. So if you look at the decision out of South Dakota in regard to how do you tax e-commerce, there's a number of different items. You have to treat similar purchases the same. But the big issue is you need a centrally place where the sales tax is deposited, so that these e-commerce people aren't sending out taxes that they collect to every small city, borough, et cetera, across the state of Alaska. So what's going on in Alaska and how they're doing this is the state of Alaska has centralized the collection of e-commerce. So if you're an e-commerce retailer and you collect an Alaska sales tax, then you submit that right directly to the state of Alaska. And so there's one centralized collection point. And then the state turns around and redistributes that back to the local taxing jurisdictions. So the local taxing jurisdiction, say like if you lived in Kenai, which has a sales tax, if you're buying, let's say, a pair of shoes down at the local sporting goods store, you're paying that local sporting good store a sales tax, and they send that right to the city of Kenai. But if you were to buy those shoes from an online e-commerce retailer, you would, of course, pay the tax to the e-commerce retailer, and the e-commerce retailer would then send that to the state of Alaska, who would then turn around and send that back to Kenai. So that's how they get into, which they feel is, would pass a legal challenge and could uphold in a court in collecting e-commerce tax. So there's probably a little more work to do on the local option tax, especially in Montana. I think we all realize that a good portion of that is going to be paid by local residents because they're much different than a resort community, which I always take, for example, here in Whitefish, which is a resort community. I only go to Whitefish a couple times a year, obviously for skiing, but I go into Missoula or Kalispell multiple times a year, a couple times a month. Maybe I'm hitting those communities. So a lot of the stuff that people would be buying would be obviously paid by local Montana residents. And so we're trying to figure out an analysis as to, okay, if I can save you $500 on your property tax bill due to a local option sales tax, how much of that tax did you actually pay yourself? And so what's the net effect of reducing your property taxes? So those are some of the things we need to continue to work through and take a little more deeper dive into those. In fact, Jen Hensley has provided us with that example up in Flathead. And there was one example that showed there was a $587 property tax relief, but doing some analysis, it looks like that property owner, would have paid about $200 in property tax, and it's new local option tax, so their net savings would have been about $387. So kind of need to look through that and make sure that if we're jumping through all the hoops for the local option tax, is it really going to produce the property tax relief? And so that's something that we need to continue to work on. We also went in and looked a little bit at basically Senate Bill 542 and the Constitutional Initiative 2 proposal that basically had to do with the Prop 13 limitation on property taxes, basically focusing on your acquisition cost for your property taxes. So we just we probably need to go through that a little bit more to see where we're at on that. And then we also discussed a little bit of ways to smooth the impact of the rapid assessment growth, tying mill levies to a dollar amount so that there will not be a benefit as assessments go up. So if you have a mill levy of 10 mill levies for local parks and recs, to tie that to a dollar amount so it doesn't float up and you happen to get a windfall just because assessed value increases, although local governments can lower those mills if they so elect, but just trying to look at. So that really ties back into 1510-420, Senate Bill 511 too. That also led us down a little bit of road. I did a little side research with, I believe Ralph was on this call, Bob Story. We reached out to Utah. Utah has a truth in taxation bill, which they've had in place since 1985. It's very similar to our 1510-420. But what's unique about Utah, every one of their mill levies float up and down. So there's really no fixed levies, although the state of Utah actually passed a mill and fixed it, probably similar to our 95 mills. I'm not sure exactly what it's used for, but that's the only one that's fixed. So what the truth in taxation does, similar to 1510-420, if a local government wants to raise their budget beyond their previous year's budget, they need to hold hearings and tell the taxpayers how much that budget is increasing And then they need to take a hard vote on it and just provide the public much more information, what their taxes are going to do to increase. And there is also a process, I really didn't dig down into it, but the citizens also can, at some point in time, require a referendum if they decide that they want to vote on that particular increase. It doesn't sound like that happens very often, if ever, maybe a few times since they've implemented that. So those are the items that we've been discussing. I'm more than happy to answer any questions, but like I said, we've gone through a lot of issues, looked at a lot of different options, and now as a committee, we really need to sit down and go through these and say, okay, what items do you think are worth pushing forward to the task force, and what recommendations would we push those forward in, and what would they look like? So that's all I've got. I'm available for any questions or any comments if any of the other committee members, subcommittee members want to express something also.
Thank you, Greg. Is there any questions or comments from other subcommittee members?
Don't see any hands raised.
Okay. I just, quick question, I think, Senator. When you guys were looking at the growth in the 15-10-420 alongside the Senate Bill 511 concept, were there other things in 15-10-420 you were looking at changing, or was it mostly encompassed in that Senate Bill 511 and that tool that DOR has?
So I'd say it's mostly encompassed in that tool that DOR had. It's been a while back that particular meeting, but we really need to probably dig down in that 15-10-420 and 511 a little bit more. The thing that I really took away from it was that if we really want to control things through 15-10-420 or 511, then we really need to get a handle on these levies that are a fixed number amount and kind of push those towards a dollar amount plus inflation.
Does anybody else just jump in? I'm going to ask a couple questions, but you mentioned, Senator, that when you looked at PTAP and I think the Veterans Assistance, that you were looking at some means testing. Was there some things that indicated that there were those with larger means that just had lower income? Is that were applying for this, or what kind of drove you in that direction, I guess?
Yeah, it was. That's particularly it. Someone could have significant amount of assets somewhere else. I mean, you might have a large amount of money sitting in a 401k plan, but you're not pulling any money out of it whatsoever. And so your income that's showing up on your tax return is very little. So, and there's other things like that too. So that just kind of led us down the road a little bit. Should we look at some means testing on some of those programs or not?
We don't have a data set on something like that, do we? I mean, I'm assuming that's more anecdotal than it is scientific. Is that true?
Yeah, as far as I know, we don't have any data
Okay.
information on that either. It's just anecdotal somewhere that, yeah, obviously if a person wants to play the game, they probably could, defer their income and get some property tax relief just by doing that.
There are two sets of hands up. Rhonda Wiggers and Commissioner Holmquist. I think Rhonda.
Go ahead, Rhonda.
First.
Senator Hertz, when you were talking about Alaska, you mentioned that if you buy online, it goes to the state. Is that only if you buy online from an area that has passed it, or is everywhere in Alaska taxed online and then it goes back to the state?
No, only an area that has passed that and has a sales tax, because I don't think that would be allowable. Because you're not treating taxpayers the same across the state then.
There was one other point about the Alaska system. It's actually run by a tax compact through the Alaska League of Municipalities, not strictly speaking the state, doing the collection of the remote sellers tax. they were coordinating that internally amongst the AML.
Correct. Yep.
And then Commissioner Holmquist.
Yeah, just some data. As we look at SB 511, I think it was proposed a 4% cap or whatever, 4% increase. In Flathead County, I had a finance come up with what we've done in the last 10 years, and it was 3.36% the last 10 years that we had increases on. So I would assume each county could come up whatever their number is, and then we could maybe look at that as we look at SB 511, because if you go to 4%, we're actually going to have an increase in our taxes, probably overall.
Yeah, I mean, 511, I can't remember where we ended up with 511, it might have been 475, but that would be the cap. I mean, it doesn't mean you have to go to that.
Okay.
So it gives you some flexibility. And I think LFD has those numbers by county, the growth over the last decade or so.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point, Commissioner. I think one of the things I remember discussing, we talked about that bill last session, was just the concept that there were certain areas that were exploding from a newly taxable standpoint. And so their growth was, they could fluctuate much more, and they had, the commissioners had more choices. It was in some of those poorer counties, I don't know how else to say it, but they just did not have newly taxable. And so they really struggled just trying to keep up with any amount of inflation. And again, as the senator said, it really was just a cap. So if they needed it, they had that option. Whereas under the current 1510-420, they didn't even have that option if they didn't have new growth. So I think that was kind of the concept there, but I think you're right on. So. Ralph, anybody else got their hands up?
No more hands are up that I can see. I can go to the slides for the education subcommittee and share that, or we can keep the screen up the way it is. I don't know how you guys would prefer it.
Do you have anything, I guess, before we leave that, Senator Hertz, do you have anything else, or are you ready to move on to education then?
Nope, I'm ready to move on to education.
Okay. Representative Bedey.
Thank you, Director Osmundson, and I would like to have the slideshow put up.
Will do. So we'll do that one first, and then it goes to that.
Yeah, that's stay on the one that says PTAC Education Subcommittee that you're on right now. All right, so what we've worked on is a bit more narrowly defined, but I'll give you just a quick update on where we're at right now and some ideas of where we're going to go forward as we're starting to drive this towards the actual definition of options. We will also be providing you just some more information, have staff providing those talks a little bit later after I go through this quick summary. One of the things, we have met once since our last meeting, and one of the things that we took up was moving school elections from May to November. As it turns out, it appears that this is a bit more complicated a matter than one would think on the surface of that. And at this point, unless directed to do otherwise, the subcommittee is stopping its effort on this particular area and focusing its attention on other particular options. Of course, the big moving piece for us is the state school levy, which is currently 95 mills. We have looked at the implications of lowering the levy to, say, 79 mills. Of course, this would result in a pretty large shift to income tax to fulfill our requirement for the funding formula, a shift on the order of $80+ million a year. This seemed to be a little bit extreme. We have not adopted a specific recommendation at this point, but most of our effort is directed right now towards taking a look at current law and our current equalization law to include House Bill 587, which was not fully implemented for 2024, and taking a look at just how much relief we actually were going to receive as a consequence of that bill. The purpose of that bill, one of the purposes of that bill, was to provide tax relief, and you'll see in some of the slides that we have here that it does achieve that. It does achieve it, though, once again at the expense of income tax contribution from the state for the for base entitlement of the schools, but it is a smaller offset than would be had if we did a complete reduction of the 95 mil levy. Another project that was put on our plate was to take a look at countywide base levies. Right now, to determine that a school district's required contribution to the minimum level of funding for the district's operating budget, that is assessed on a district-wide or on a district basis. What we're looking at here and examining a little bit further is to take a look at what if the assessment was made on a countywide basis, as is the case for the current school retirement levy, which is a countywide levy. There will be no net change in tax burden across the state, property tax burden across the state, should we move to a countywide base levy, but it would cause some equalization within counties. And so, which may get to a tax fairness issue. I think we'll have a chance to discuss that a little bit further in a later slide. And finally, what we refer to as the Iverson option is what I would call a comprehensive revision of equalization policy. We have not delved into that in detail. Expect to take that up in our next meeting as that gets fleshed out. I will speak for myself and not the subcommittee right now. I think that this is a very innovative approach to school funding in general. I think that my read of it is it would intersect in some respects with what we're doing with homestead exemptions. And then all of that being said, I'm not sure that this is an option that could be developed in time for implementation by this or adoption by this particular legislature. Now, that's just my preliminary read on this, and my colleagues, I'm sure, may have different opinions on that. I would also say that something like the Iverson option is something that it would seem to me would be a topic that would be ideal to be addressed in a more thorough manner during the decennial school funding review, which will occur next biennium right after, and we'll start up right after the 2025 session. So we can have I think I'll pause for just a moment here, understanding that you're going to see some slides on the state school levy and on the county, the thought of going to a countywide base levy. I think Senator Hertz has his hand up.
Oh, Senator Hertz.
Yes, thanks, Chair Bedey. In regards to moving the school elections, I can see why you decided kind of back off on those. Very complicated. But at the same time, did you guys discuss it all in regard to voter turnout thresholds?
Yes, yes. Thank you, Senator Hertz. That's a good question. I would say that is not a dead issue. There is already statute that deals with bond levies or bond issues that probably could be relooked at. One of the there were some objections raised or concerns, I should say, not objections raised about placing turnout limits that might be related. There may be some legal or constitutional issues. I'm not in a position to elaborate on this. I think we'll drive this to at one of my subcommittee or next meets. I think we will drive this towards a conclusion, but no specific recommendations at this particular point.
Representative Bedey, I see no more hands. Oh,
Oh, we got a couple here. Hang on a second.
Yep.
Cindy has one.
Okay, Representative Byrne, when you had the conversation about making a move from district-based levies to county-wide based levies, was there any conversation about the potential to revisit old school district consolidations? Because many of those cross county lines.
So I'm not sure who just spoke, so I can't address you directly, but I will answer the
This was
question.
Cindy Johnson just asking that question, Representative.
I'm sorry.
So at no, at this point, we have not delved deep enough into this particular option to take a look at that nuance, but I'm sure that staff is taking notes right now, so that when we do so, we can take that into consideration.
Thank you.
I think we have Lance Melton. Do you have your hand up?
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify a couple of things. First of all, with regard to elections in November, MTSBA stood back on this in the spirit of collaboration with other members of the subcommittee and because of the effect on other involved parties, notably county election officials. I want to make sure that the task force is aware that MTSBA remains interested and engaged in the concept of switching to November elections. And we have, it's complicated and it is probably beyond the scope of what we're trying to do here, but would not want anybody to read into that we're somehow disinterested in ensuring voter turnout. And I'm one of them that raised the issue with regard to arbitrary turnout requirements, supermajority requirements in terms of the potential impact under the Constitution on potentially discriminating among qualified electors who are all on an equal footing by virtue of their status as people living in Montana of the age of majority and thus able to cast a vote. And if the system is structured in a way other than by driving elections to where turnout is higher, I do think that there are some potential constitutional issues that we'd have to delve into and analyze further. And then last but not least, in terms of going to county levies versus district levies and looking at either uniformity in those levies or variable levies as they exist right now, we'll have to be continually mindful of unintended consequences on impact aid, federal impact aid, which goes predominantly to school districts living in areas with a lot of American Indian trust land, thus a lower taxable value. And depending upon the source by which you describe that, the generation of that revenue, it can either work in harmony with the impact aid laws or actually result in a loss of funding. So that's something that I would just kind of want to make sure that we are aware on an ongoing basis. And then, also with regard to this idea of uniformity, I certainly am interested in discussing further at the subcommittee level, and I'll hold my powder dry for that purpose. But you can calculate pretty easily with the information that you can get from the Office of Public Instruction what would happen if you generated uniform levies in each community to generate the same $164 million that is currently generated through between 0 and 50 mills. So just very easy there, about 18 uniform mills in both elementary and high school districts would generate about the equivalent amount of money that's currently being generated by between 0 mills all the way up to 50. So just a little bit of additional commentary there, but interested in continuing those discussions. Thank you.
And if I might interject, Director Osmundson, I want to thank the Vice Chair Melton for speaking on this particular issue. It isn't with respect to the election dates that it isn't that it's impossible to do. I just think that the necessary coordination that we'll have to do with other jurisdictions and with election administrators is probably something that we cannot complete by the by the end of our efforts here. Not to say that we couldn't carry that forward later.
That makes sense. Thanks, Representative. I see we have Commissioner Olkers.
Oh, yeah, thank you. As a county commissioner, we're still always concerned about these 95 mills. They were basically calculated at the 77.9, and then bank mills were used to bring it back up. And bank mills, the Department of Revenue said they're going to be running out of those this cycle or next cycle. But those 95 mills 10 years ago generated about 31.9% of the money going, and the rest was the state general fund to fill the pot for education. And even before the big jump last year, it went from 33.5% to 37%. So that percent, the property taxpayers, keeps on going up and relieving the amount that comes out of the general fund to fill the big pot for education. So I go back to, if we can get a 3% cap on those 95 mills through legislation, some way of capping those mills. I know the Lou Jones's bill gets some money back, which is all good to have in place. But if we can do the combination of capping those and plus putting in that special revenue fund, I'd like to see some combination worked out there or looked at.
Further discussion. I guess, Mr. Melton.
I just think these are deep waters and we're going to have that discussion at the subcommittee level. I can tell you right now that the entire additional revenues that have been generated by the 95 mills has more than been spent by the state in keeping property taxes down through expansions in the GTB formula. And you can confirm this with staff, but the increase in the GTB ratio from 193% in 2017 to 262% today has resulted in the state funding schools through the GTB formula by about $100 million more than they would if that GTB formula were still sitting at 193%. And correspondingly, if it was sitting at 193%, local property taxpayers would be paying $100 million more right now than they are. So it's deep waters. It's worth taking a look at. And I think that one of the things that we have to remain mindful is that the court found not just that interpretation of a float downward was inconsistent with the law, but actually incompatible with the Constitution. And the circumstances that they found when they ordered the state to increase the state's role in funding schools was an excessive reliance on local variable mills. And I'm not sure that you don't have that all over again, even with the GTB increase, when your base levies are currently varying between 0 mills and 50 to get to the mandated minimum spending required under law.
Thank you, Lance. Any further comment before we let Representative Bedey go on? Okay.
Seeing no further comment, I'd like to turn this over to Julia Patton to just run through another set of numbers for you to look at. And Julia, you're on.
Thank you, Representative Bedey. For the record, Julia Patton.
Go ahead and do you have the same slide show up on your machine?
Yep, I can do that.
Perfect.
For the record, Julia Patton with the Legislative Fiscal Division. This is a slide that you probably recall from the training that we did at the first task force meeting. I think it's just a good reminder before we dive into some of the more complicated scepter account calculations that the scepter account is the new state special revenue account that receives the 95 mills. And so there is a mechanism in law that takes 55% of any increase in the 95 mills and uses it to dial up the countywide retirement GTB And then eventually it will also affect state major maintenance aid and debt service assistance. I just like to clarify, because sometimes there's been some confusion. The SEPTA account is currently active, receiving revenue from the 95 mills. The dialing mechanism will kick in fiscal year 2026. But in a way it kicks in 2025 because the amount that it would have dialed up the county retirement in an earlier version of the bill was hard coded in for fiscal year 2025. And just keep in mind that that works in reverse if there's a reduction in revenue. So not necessarily a reduction in mills, but a reduction in revenue from the 95 mills will dial back the contribution to the retirement GTB, and then again, the state major maintenance aid and debt service assistance down the road. So one thing this fund does, and the way this 55% mechanism works, is that it maintains the balance between property tax and other taxes in the state general fund, largely income tax, in funding K-12, and then also maintains a balance between state and local funding for K-12. So this was a slide that I put together for the last education subcommittee meeting of the task force, talking about some various different mill scenarios and how the SEPTA account would reduce local property taxes. So again, maintaining that 55%. If we were to look at present law, that's that orange line where the 95 mills are fixed. Again, when I say fixed here, I really mean, you know, we're fixing the 95 mills. They're calculated with the 15, 10, 4, 20 calculation, but then bank mills are used to make up the difference. And so for the next 4 years, that's been projected out, assuming a 3% growth in taxable value in non-reappraisal years and 6% growth in reappraisal years. So those are pretty loose calculations. Keep in mind, this is largely a qualitative representation to give you an idea of how these different scenarios would work. So in fiscal year 2025, you can see that $33 million reduction is hard-coded. And so any change in the number of mills levied would have to come from legislative action, likely in the 2025 session, or of course afterward. And so this slide is going to show the various different scenarios. There's an assumption made with this 110 mil idea. There's nothing special about 110 mils aside from that it's about 15 mil larger than 95, similar to 79 being about 15 below. And the assumption for this blue line is that all of the increase from 95 to 110 would be run through the SEPTA account formula to, again, reduce local property taxes 55% of that increase. And so you can see if the mills were then on the reverse side dropped to 79 and fixed, you wouldn't get quite the same reduction to local property taxes. And then if you were to drop the mill to 79 and float them, you would get an even smaller reduction as time goes forward, just because they would be limited to half the rate of inflation growth. So I know that's a lot to digest. There's a lot going on here. One of the things we talked about and that I was asked to run some scenarios for, we're changing the 55% dial. So what were to happen if, like an earlier version of the bill, House Bill 587, say it was about 35%, or on the, inverse side, if that dial were ramped up to say 75%. And so again, I want to take a look at current law. The last slide you saw was really just showing the local property tax reductions. This one is going to show the tax impacts from the SEPTA across different types of or different tax sources. So you have income tax at the state level for education in green. You have the 95 mills in the kind of periwinkle color, and then you have property taxes for retirement, which is in orange. And the reason we're focusing in on retirement here is because that is the dial that the SEPTA account will impact first, and at least for the time being, probably the only dial, until there's enough of an increase in the 95 mills that it will spill over into major maintenance aid and debt service. So again, you're at 55% of that delta in the 95 mils going towards local property tax reductions. So you can see fiscal year 2023, this was kind of our status quo. There were some changes in fiscal year 2024, largely the increase in the 95 mils in revenue brought in by the 95 mils and a corresponding decrease in income tax. So if you think, if you can think like a driving metaphor, maybe we veered off a little bit and then there's a correction. And part of that correction is from House Bill 587, but there's also a lag in the GTB formula that kind of corrects in 2025. And so you can see that here in the income tax line where the GTB formula will lag a year and self-correct in 2025, and you'll get a corresponding increase in state income tax contributions to K-12 funding that when combined with the impacts from House Bill 587 will reduce local property taxes. You're not going to see the local property tax reduction from the GTB lag correction here because we're not showing local mills for school districts, for individual school districts and their base formula, but you do get to see the impacts of the $33 million in fiscal year 2025 from House Bill 587 on the property tax for school retirement. So you can see that orange line it's down in fiscal year 2025 and then continues to decrease ever, to a degree over time as the 95 mills bring in more revenue. So this is our state with current law. If the scepter mechanism were to change back to say 35% rather than 55% of the delta going to reduce local property taxes, you can see that the dotted lines here are essentially current law. So you can see the change between 55% and 35%. And basically in the first year, that's about a $5 million impact. In the second year, that would be an $8 million impact, and then about 14, and then about 17 by the time you get down to fiscal year 2028. And one thing to note here is this is a shift from income tax onto local property taxes for retirement. So you can see that, again, you're shifting that income tax line down a little bit and that local property tax line up. And so if you're kind of thinking of these lines as parallel, if there's a balance being maintained between property tax and income tax, changing that dial will kind of change the balance of which tax source is paying for K-12 education. And so here's the reverse scenario where present law again is shown in the dotted line. That's the 55% that's active law right now. And if that mechanism were dialed up to 75%, say, instead of having a shift from income tax to property tax for county retirement, this is a reverse. This shifts from local property taxes for retirement to income tax. And so you can see the property tax line is even, decreasing at an even steeper slope here, whereas income tax is increasing at a steeper slope above. So the tax impacts are going to be the exact same amount just because it's a 20% change on either side. But really the direction of the shift is what we're talking about here. So on the first slide, it's a shift from income to property, and the second slide is a shift from property to income. So I think that's about all I had. I know those are some pretty concept dense slides. I just keep in mind that these are, I've got the assumptions down at the bottom. Again, they're meant to be more qualitative to show you what would happen in the event that these changes were made. Obviously, other, legislative changes and, just world events can impact the effects of some of these changes in a way that we can't anticipate.
Thank you, Julia. So one comment I'd like to make on this is we provided you this presentation just to give you a sense of the magnitude of changes that might occur if we were to deal with the so-called scepter dial, 55% dial, for lack of a better term. Also, before our next meeting, we're going to take a look at changes to the GDP ratio, which have been alluded to before. And once again, a change to the GDP ratio will can lead to more of the 95 mil revenue going out in equalization at the expense of income tax, of a shift to income taxes. So more to follow on that. As a practical matter, one of the next steps that the Education Subcommittee has to take is to work with Senator Hertz's committee analysts. We have to work with the analysts to see how to incorporate any changes that are proposed for the 95 mill levy into the modeling that Eric is doing on behalf from DOR is doing on behalf of that team. So that's a practical thing, but it seems to me that the workhorse for the modeling effort is going to be the modeling that Eric has done, and one of the practical things we need to do is incorporate and provide the necessary input for that. What I see coming next time we have a full PTAC meeting, what I see coming out will be with respect to current law and adjustments to the GTP ratio and or the scepter model are a couple of specific options that for which we will show the shifts from one levy to another, but also the overall net reduction in property taxes paid, or if not the reduction, then the slowing of the growth of that because of the changes we make in these parameters. Now I have one more slide for you to take a look at. Gets to the our task that we received last time was to take a look at county wide base levying. And so Mr. McCracken from Legislative Services, we're just going to quickly kind of walk through what that would look like. We have not done any specific modeling on this, but I'll say no more and turn it over to Pad.
Yeah, thanks, Representative Bedey. For the record, Pad McCracken, Legislative Services. Maybe before Julia throws that slide back up, the final slide, I'll just real quick walk through in case you need a reminder or didn't know this about school funding and retirement costs. The employer costs that every district contributes to our retirement systems, TRS and PERS, because school districts employ members of both, are pooled at the county level. So think about your county and the school districts within your county. You as a county taxpayer are contributing to the retirement costs of all of the employees in every school district in your county. And the way that's done is quite simple. The estimated retirement costs at each school district are sent to the county superintendent, the county treasurer, and pooled, and then mills are levied to raise the requisite funding. Of course, any non-levy revenues, fund balance is applied first, and there's also then state retirement, county retirement GTB, and we've been talking about that a lot as part of the House Bill 587 conversation in Julia's previous slides. Counties with lower tax wealth per kid, per A and B, receive state GTB, guaranteed tax base aid, as a subsidy per mill to keep their mills down. And in a sense, so school retirement costs are twice equalized. They're equalized once at the county level and once again by the state amongst all 56 counties. And with that little brief introduction, Julia, would you mind throwing that slide back up? Thank you. So fairly dense slide, maybe better as a reference than a PowerPoint presentation, but in the upper left there, you've got a table that just very quickly shows that we've got some variation in the number of base mills. And remember, base mills are statutorily, formulaically required mills to make sure that every district fills itself up to its minimum base general fund budget. And so despite some enhanced equalization in the last 7 or 8 years through ratcheting up that base GTB multiplier, we've still got some variety. And the very difficult to read maps on the right-hand side of this diagram are available in the subcommittees materials, but they show some of this variability. And basically, in a nutshell, the gold districts, the gold colored districts here have very low base mills, and the deeper blue have higher base mills. And if your eye is trained to counties, you can see, for example, in Garfield County, we've got some very low base mill districts right next to higher base mill districts. And the whole idea with county equalization of these is that you would have uniform mills within every county and eliminate any variation within the county through this countywide equalization of base mills. You'd basically be taking that the area that's circled in red, if you recognize our general fund graphic here in the middle of this slide, you'd be taking that area that's currently filled with local property taxes and GTB from the state, and you'd be filling that with a countywide levy, and the counties would receive a state county GTB subsidy to keep those mills fairly uniform between the counties in the state. I hope that was a useful and brief walkthrough of the concept, Rep. Bedey.
Thank you, Pat. So, a lot to chew on there. Obviously, as we pointed out earlier, there may be some concerns about cross-county districts or the impact on impact aid, as was pointed out by Mr. Melton a little bit earlier. I will say that during our brief discussion of this at our last subcommittee meeting, Mr. Story pointed out that House Bill 203, which was passed in the last session, and which I carried, has a provision that addresses tax equity between districts that are losing children or are basically not losing children, but having children from those districts attend out-of-state districts. So we already have a mechanism that is in place now that may accomplish at least part of what's envisioned here in terms of of equalization. But you're more to follow. I see Representative Jones, who has thought deeply about this particular topic, has his hand up.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
All right. Yeah, I have thought a lot about this, and there is if we go back to the slide that brought this up before David so helpfully decided to take on this section for us. Montana has 397 school districts, yet when we look at our surrounding states, they have some of them way less than half, but certainly, and it's a lot fewer school districts. Well, one of the outcomes from all of our school districts, and even within a given county, you can find school districts that are substantially different. Some that are not milling at all, and others that are milling very, very heavily. So the concept became, if not to challenge the need for these attendance centers in any manner, but to ensure that the taxpayers across the county had some level of equalization, even though they were maybe arbitrarily divided by a line in the ground that they could not see, and the property on both sides looked remarkably the same. I would point out that since we're only talking the base mills equalization, that if you were in a school district that chose to vote extra mills, the above base area, above the red circle you see on your screen, that would still be on your districts, whichever one of the 397 you're in. And so the thought process has become of how do we form some equalization? Because what we're generally seeing is that we're putting as much, if not more, money out than a bunch of the other states that are equally rural, South Dakota, Dakota, Idaho, that are potentially as rural or more so than we are on a per student basis. But we often struggle to be able to get that to the teacher in the classroom. And if we found some way to deal with this interesting mix of 0 mills to 51 mill districts and get some equalization there, would we be able to also potentially talk about keeping these attendance centers and maybe sharing some administrative expenses or what are other items across these lines, and thus make our ability to deliver enhanced student options to students anywhere in the state at a more affordable cost. So given that 56% of our property taxes go to schools and that we are a rural state, this certainly is a Herculean task, but I believe it is critical in its nature. My 2 bits.
Thank you, Representative Jones.
Any other comments on this section? Representative, do you have more you wanted to present, or we open it up for questions? Maybe that's all.
No, we have nothing more to present. I mean, clearly we have there have been several good suggestions made here, and I'll be meeting with assigned staff on this as soon as I can, hopefully by the end of the week, so we can define what we're going to take for our next step in each of these particular with regard to each of these particular issues. And so that, with that being said, I have nothing more on this to offer myself.
Do you believe you'll have the information required or necessary to kind of run a data set in terms of, you know, like was described, jurisdictions cross county lines? Is that something that we can pull or you'll be able to have access to, do you believe?
I would like to withhold answer or not answer that question until I have consulted with staff on this. I suspect that this is difficult. Whether it's impossible, I don't know.
That's fair. Okay, is there anything else on the education subcommittee? I don't see anybody's hands up, but I don't see everybody. So I'm going to say no unless I hear somebody pipe up. So with
Mr.
that,
Chairman, I don't see anyone with their hand up.
Perfect.
And Representative Jones, I can show the slide from the committee, or you can present directly as you so choose.
I'll go ahead and show the committee slide, and then ultimately we'll turn it over to Eric Dale for a demo. But please feel free to show the committee slide.
That should be up now.
Okay, so this is the work of our committee. We had a very productive meeting, and thanks to a Herculean effort by the DOR and Mr. Eric Dale in particular, we saw the creation of a very fascinating model. So stepping back slightly, our general discussion obviously involved around how do we provide lower rates for owner dwellings and for long-term rentals, what was going to be a responsible revenue source. Because if we just changed rates, obviously given that property taxes become 75% or so of the market value in the state, the transfer to the other classes was simply huge. It wiped the other classes out. Or if we found some way to put it on the income tax, then we're just transferring it to W-2 income tax paying Montanans. Our background information was we took a look and we reminded ourselves that currently 21% of the total property taxable value in Montana is being mailed to an out-of-state address. And this seems to have been increasing about 1% a year, showing a substantial increase in what appears to be out-of-state ownership of Montana properties, with the out-of-state owners obviously are most likely not paying Montana income tax. We've also seen our works that shows the increase in both vacation homes and short-term dwellings, as well as the work that shows there is about 13 million visitors coming to Montana a year. And I'm just doing this as a backdrop to say where this was coming from. And that as another portion of what we were looking at was noticed that approximately the western 60% of Montana was experiencing an incredible destination demand. Market value increases on homes up to 67%, but in the 40% on the eastern side, there was areas where there was 0% market value increase, and a lot of the increases were in the single digits. And so where these out-of-state demand, these rentals and movings and et cetera are occurring, it was drastically bidding up market values, which was putting significant pressure on the purchase of owner dwellings and long-term rentals. So anyway, our approach was to take a look at a couple options for the homestead exemptions. And of course, because the residential tax is tied with a factor of 1.4 to the commercial tax, we have to look at the two in some form of an integrated manner. So two models of homestead exemptions were examined, and Eric will show you these in much more detail. And they produced what I felt was incredibly promising results, because in an area where we're bringing in north of $2 billion in property tax, while we like to think that the accommodation taxes, the percentages there can make a huge difference, in truth, it's kind of like spitting in a bucket of water. It's not enough dollars to be able to have a significant change. So we took and we just made up a number to begin with, but the general concept is, in order to meet our constitutional framework, you would effectively pick a number, increase overall residential taxes. They're 1.35 now, but you'd say, well, the residential taxes, and the example we began with is now 2.2%. But if you are an owner dwelling or a long-term rental, and that's a little difficult to identify, but that was the charge, an owner dwelling or a long-term rental, you would get a discount to 1.1%. If you think how that would work, there would be an effective transfer of dollars to those folks that didn't declare. Well, you'd have some to second homes, but you'd also have a significant transfer to those folks that did not live in their home more than 7 months. They weren't owner dwellings, didn't declare Montana residency. And the same truth, of course, on short-term rentals. That was the one model we looked at. It produced an interesting change. I'll have Eric go through that here in just a second, but it certainly generated a huge amount of income. And I'm not suggesting those are the right numbers. I need to be clear when I say that. We needed to start somewhere, and we looked at a number of examples. That was our starting point. The nice part about his model is that it's capable of being adjusted to any value. And so the factors we set was 2.2, 1.1 to begin with, and we decided that at what level home, right? Beyond what value did the higher rate, it all returned to the higher rate. And I believe our first model was 3 million. We also incorporated, because we had to decouple from the commercial tax, we decided we would take a look at if our goal was to help encourage the mom and pop shops, the little homes, cafes, and shops that dot Main Street, then our thought was, well, we break the commercial tax apart. It's currently 1.89, 1.4 times the 1.35. We would break it apart, and we'd have a bifurcated rate akin to the business equipment tax. We began by saying it's 1.5% up to $3 million worth of property. Beyond that, it's 2%. Again, we can set these numbers at any value, but that was how we generated our dollars. And then we took a look at how these dollars, what it brought in, what the changes were. And obviously we looked at it at the state level, and now of course you got to drop it into the county level, because there's still always going to be some tax transfer. Our hope was we would generate significant enough revenue that there wouldn't be a lot of cross transfer to other classes. So that explains the work we did. The other variation we looked at was the fixed, that a bill very much like Representative Esmond carried, where you just set an amount. We're going to give a homestead exemption on the first $50,000 of your home. And what happened there? Now that, and again, you'll be able to look at that directly. We found that, however, transferred significant costs to other classes, and also to the W-2 income tax paying Montanans. That being said, so that area we flushed out. I think it provides a realistic method for potentially buying down owner dwellings and long-term rentals. If we can work on, the devil will be in the details. So we don't have to come back to these other points, and we'll have Eric spend his time in the end here demoing these deals. Let me just talk about the seasonal accommodation tax. We looked at this as well. An additional 1%, both seasonal and what it brought in, to have meaningful impact, whether we redirect, for instance, the money going to the Historical Society, what is paid for to it, or additional money to have meaningful impact on property tax. It's simply not a big enough number. Now, it potentially could have a use in redirecting some monies back towards roads, for example, what 442 that no longer exists attempted to do, and would have a more direct linkage. So there may be some uses for that. But for an overall fix to our property tax system, it did not seem large enough, and nor did the gas tax, and gas taxes are extremely political. Obviously, our local option sales tax, Senator Hertz, and I listened to his report, is doing wonderful work there. And of course, Representative Bedey is taking care of the other options. At this point, to help show exactly what we mean by the Comstead and Homestead exemptions, Eric, are you at the point where you can do a demo and talk through your work?
Yeah, I can certainly do that.
Well, then I'll turn it over to you and I'll quit babbling.
Oh. All right, hopefully everyone can see my screen. So for the record, Eric Dale with the Montana Department of Revenue in the Tax Policy and Research Unit. And gonna update everybody on some work I've been doing with the Homestead and Comstead model. Before we begin, here's a slide that we've shown in the past. Just wanted to kind of refresh everyone's memory. This is the growth in the median value home by county across the state. I presented this slide to show that there is quite a bit of variation, obviously, as I'm sure everyone's aware, in the overall market appreciation in the different counties. You can see a real drastic difference between the eastern part of the state that saw more modest levels of appreciation relative to the western part of the state that saw greater levels of appreciation. However, as I've mentioned in the past, the overall value is but one part of the factors that will ultimately determine the property tax liability. So this next slide here is the change in total taxes by county for a median value home. It's organized from the largest change in taxes to the smallest change. As you can see, the blue line represents the total tax increase. The orange lines represent the change in the 95 mil taxes, and then the gray line across the top shows the rebate amount, just for reference. So as I said, this is organized by the greatest increase here in Gallatin County. And then at the other end is Fallon County, which actually saw a decrease in the average taxes for a median home. However, If I organize it by the change in taxable value, it looks a little bit different. Obviously Gallatin County is still at the top here. But this bar, the blue bars are not organized in the same manner, I guess. And again, that comes back to the idea that there's more that determines your property tax totals than simply the value, as the change in the 95 mills corresponds directly to the change in the total taxable value of the properties, as those mills were fixed and did not change. So with that, we'll move into sort of the idea of this model and the policy that's being laid out. So from what I heard from the committee, there was a desire to look at a homestead exemption, and what that meant was a tiered rate structure for primary residence. So the first portion of a primary residence would be taxed at a lower overall rate, and then anything above that amount would be taxed at a higher rate, and then anything that wasn't considered a primary residence would generally be taxed at the second higher rate. As I mentioned, there would presumably be a cap on this total amount, so that, again, only the first portion of the value under that cap would receive the preferential rate. In discussions with the committee, there was also a desire to include rental improvements and rental properties to make sure renters were also participating in the benefit of this policy. We set the benefit to rental improvements at the same amount that the residential primary rate was also set to. That wouldn't necessarily have to be the case, and that would be a policy consideration for the ultimate committee. Similarly, for commercial properties, we looked at a tiered rate structure. Only instead of primary residence, we applied this tiered rate structure to all Class 4 commercial property, and only allowed the benefit to be applied to the first portion of the commercial property, so that we would be essentially transferring some of the overall tax burden from small commercial properties to large commercial properties. However, determining what small and what large is based on market values is kind of one of those details that Representative Jones alluded to. The other thing to keep in mind as we play with these dials is not only what the overall dial rates are set to, but how they are set in relation to each other. As an example, if you think about two properties that are both valued at $300,000, one is a residential property and one is commercial. Under current law, it's less important that those properties are valued at $300,000 so much as the commercial property pays 1.4 times the amount of taxes as the residential property, because that overall tax rate is set at 1.4 times the rate of the residential property. So again, it's not so much important that it's set at 1.35 and 1.89. It's that 1.89 is 1.4 times 1.35, which is a lot of numbers, I know, but it's kind of an important concept. So I just wanted to reiterate that, if you will. So this was the task at hand and the policy that I ultimately tried to model. In order to do this, we basically separated the properties into three main categories. So primary residence, commercial properties, and then everyone else, and tried to estimate the rental amounts from that everyone else category. To calculate the impact of this policy, we basically calculated the overall tax burden for each of those groups of properties, and each property based on the current taxable value and the current year mills. Then to look at the proposed law, so that was using the current values is the current law, obviously. To look at the proposed law, we recalculated what the new taxable values would be under the different scenarios, wherever those dials were set to, and then summed everything for every taxing jurisdiction across the state and recalculated what the mills would need to be in order to generate the exact same dollar amount of revenue as was the case under current law. The one exception to that is the state 95 mills and the university 6 mills. Those were held constant in the new proposed scenario. So there's a bit of a wrinkle there, if you will. Then we compared the two results essentially. So by way of an example, I sort of picked some numbers to look at. So under this scenario, we looked at a preferential rate for residential dwellings of 1%, and then the secondary rate at 1.75%, and applied this preferential rate only on the first $500,000 in market value for primary residence, and then all other class 4 residential property would have the 1.75% applied to it. Similarly, for commercial property, we applied a rate of 1.4% on the first $1 million in this example, and then a rate of 2.45% on anything over that $1 million. This scenario also includes rental improvements, and so those were taxed at 1%, which corresponds to this preferential rate for primary residential improvements or primary residences. The one thing I did want to mention is, as I said, we did try and estimate the proportion of total properties that are attributable to long-term rentals. However, that is one of the more heroic assumptions, if you will. We did that. We came up with that estimate by looking at the U.S. Census Bureau's estimate for renter-occupied housing units, and then applied those proportions to the data we had. So once these dials have been set, if you will, we can look at the results. So here I calculated the current law values, the proposed law values, the overall difference on a statewide basis, and the difference in percentage terms. I tried to segregate the property, as I mentioned. So all class 4 residential property is here, but then that's further divided into the home sites or primary residence for class 4 residential. The estimated amounts that is attributable to resident or rental improvements and long-term rentals, and then all other properties. So this would include vacant land, vacation homes that are generally vacant. Short-term rentals would presumably be in this category as well, and basically anything that doesn't fit into these first two categories. The next portion is commercial property. I broke it out between properties that are under the threshold or considered small, and properties that are over the threshold or large. It's important to note that even these large commercial properties do receive the benefits of the reduced rate for commercial property, but only up to this predetermined amount. Then I also calculated what these amounts were for agricultural property, so class 3, and then all other, which is not exclusively centrally assessed property, but is primarily centrally assessed property. So again, here's the current law values that were estimated, and then here are the values that we estimated for this scenario and the difference. So in this scenario, you can see that home sites are estimated to have a decrease in taxable value of $189.8 million statewide, and that would correspond to a $98 million decrease in taxes for those properties. Similarly, rental improvements would see a decrease of $127 million, and that would correspond to a $61.5 million decrease in overall taxes for those properties. The all other category, because they would see an overall rate increase from 1.35 to 1.75, would see an increase in their taxable value to the tune of $320 million and an increase in overall taxes of $129 million. Similarly, the small commercial properties would see a decrease in the taxable value of $38.9 million, which corresponds to a decrease in taxes of $20.4 million, whereas the larger commercial properties would see an overall increase in taxable value of $65.5 million approximately, which corresponds to a $43 million increase in taxes. For agricultural and other property, we did not change their taxable values in any of these scenarios, so these numbers are zero. However, their overall taxes did change as a result of shifting mills for the different jurisdictions those properties exist in. That was for the statewide, but as we mentioned, there's a lot of variation in taxes depending on the local area, so we also broke these numbers out to specific county level amounts. So similarly here, home sites in Lewis and Clark County would see a decrease of 8.9 million in taxable value. And that would correspond to a $9 million decrease in taxes. Rental improvements would see a taxable value decrease of 6.4 and a decrease in taxes of $3.3 million, whereas all other class 4 residential property would see an overall increase of $9.4 million in taxable value and an increase in taxes of $7.4 million. Similarly, there would be a decrease in small commercial properties taxable value of $2.3 million, which translates to a $1.3 million decrease in taxes. The large commercial properties would see an increase in taxable value of $3.3 million and an increase in total taxes of 3.6. Because the overall taxable value for the county is decreasing by almost $15 million, mills would presumably float up to make up the difference. So they would increase by 40.1 mills in this example. Overall taxes would decrease by 1.3 million for a variety of reasons. These are summary numbers. However, you might be more interested in what would happen on example properties. So we also calculated what the impact would be to median value homes under these scenarios. So here is the median value home for every county. And we calculated what the current law taxable values were, the weighted average mills, and what the estimated taxes would be for each of these counties. Then we recalculated those values based on the proposed law, where the first $500,000 is taxed at 1%, and then anything over that is taxed at 1.75%. And here's the difference. So here's the difference in total dollar amounts for taxable value. Here's the mill shift that is occurring in each of these counties. And then here's the overall impact in taxes. As you can see, the taxable value percentage decrease is very similar, or is similar for almost all the counties, because the decrease should correspond to whatever the percent change was from 1.35%, which is the current law rate, to this 1% amount for the first $500,000. And because most of the median value homes are under $500,000, that's what this value corresponds to. As you can see, the Gallatin median home taxable value decrease is 13.34%, which is slightly less than the other counties because their median home value is over this $500,000 amount that we set. I also calculated what the average value home was in each of these counties in addition to the median value. That was requested at the last meeting. Again, it's similar story. You can see that the median value home in Madison County is over $2.5 million. So they would actually see an increase in the taxable value for that property, whereas most other average valued homes by county would see a decrease. It's kind of a wall of numbers, might be difficult to interpret. So I also mapped these values. So the color of the county on this map corresponds to the overall decrease in the median value taxes. So the darker the county, the larger the decrease in the median home value taxes. I can appreciate that this is probably hard to read, but if we zoom in on one of these counties, there's also some summary information in each of these little boxes next to each county. So for Lewis and Clark County, again, over homeowners and renters would see a decrease in taxes of 17.9%, whereas all other residential property would see an increase of 38%. Commercial property overall would see an increase of 9.5%. Agricultural property would see an increase of 5.6%. And then all other property would see an increase of 6.4%. Mills would float up by 40.96 mills, and overall taxes for Lewis and Clark County would go down by 0.9%. And then there's another example for Powell County, which just happens to be next to Lewis and Clark. These numbers, like I said, come straight from these tables that we looked at a second ago. So as you can see, here's where those numbers come from for this particular scenario. So this is one scenario, as Representative Jones alluded to. we just sort of picked some numbers to give you an example. However, we also wanted to look at multiple scenarios and then try and compare those different scenarios. So here we've done that. This first line represents the example we just walked through. So this is a preferential rate for residential property of 1.0% and then a secondary rate of 1.75 available on the first $500,000 in market value. For commercial property, the preferential rate is 1.4 and then 2.45 after those properties exceed that limit, which we set the limit at $1 million. So here are the values for each of these. I also put the current law amounts down here at the bottom just for reference. So we can kind of talk through some of the scenarios I started to look at. This is by no means exhaustive, but these first block of numbers, so lines 2 through 13, were ones that were just sort of specifically requested as we started looking at this information or started modeling these. So those are there. Line 14 is kind of interesting. This would correspond to a homestead exemption applied similar to House Bill 390 of the last session, which was Representative Essman's bill to provide a 100% exemption on the first $50,000 of all residential property. As you can see in this scenario, the home sites would see a decrease in overall taxes to the tune of about $60 million, and that would be made up by all other classes of property. That particular piece of legislation did not include rentals, and so they would see an increase of $7 million approximately. The next scenarios that I kind of looked at were sort of trying to set the secondary rates and the cap, and then figuring out what this first preferential rate would need to be in order to create as close to a taxable value neutral scenario as I could. So here we can see the overall impact of the general fund is approximately a decrease of $600,000, which is not much given the other assumptions that went into this model. But we can see under this scenario, we are reducing the taxes for home sites by 177 million, for rental improvements by approximately 75 million, but then we're going to increase the total taxes for all other class 4 residential property by 219 million. Similarly, would increase the overall taxes on all class 4 commercial property by 15 million and all other property by 18 million and a little under $1 million for ag property. I think that's all I wanted to say on this slide. These are statewide numbers, and they came just straight out of this scenario that we looked at in our example. But we also wanted to look at the county specific examples for these different scenarios. So here's that analysis. So this first line corresponds to the scenario we were just looking at with the 1% rate, 1.75% rate, but it is for Lewis and Clark County specifically. And then here are the numbers for Lewis and Clark County under the other scenarios. Yeah, that's where they come from, and those should correspond to these numbers right here. So when I was setting the dials, it's obviously important to think about where to set that cap and how big of a preferential rate to grant the primary residence. So this graph shows the distribution of the market value of primary resident homes with the blue lines here, and then these lines across the solid lines. The orange one is the effective tax rate for each of these categories of property. The orange line is current law, and the gray line is the proposed law. So under this scenario, we would be transferring the overall tax burden for these lower value homes and putting it on, increasing the tax burden on some of the higher value homes, if that makes sense. So you can see right about $1 million is kind of where they pass. Since I did this for residential homes, I also looked at the distribution of commercial properties and calculated their average effective tax rates. So this orange line is the average tax rate for each of the different valued properties under current law. And then if we looked at granting a preferential treatment for the first $1 million in overall market value, we can see we would shift that down, and then it would start to increase. The overall effective tax rate would start to increase as we approached $1 million, and then would phase up as a smaller and smaller portion of that particular property's value was allowed to receive the preferential treatment, if you will. So those are things to consider. And then I'm not entirely sure where the committee would like to go next, but you know, we can talk about those next steps, what scenarios you would like to see, what rates, if there's any additional analysis for the individual scenario, or if there's additional analysis comparing the scenarios. Please feel free to let me know. The other thing to think about just real quickly is as we move forward, this is all based on 2023 data and the first round of rebates. Presumably we will have another round of rebates that we will incorporate into this model. And when we tax year 2024 values are available, we will also try to incorporate those.
So Eric, do you have your live model where you can just
I do, and that was something
pop
else I
that up
wanted
once and
to.
let's do a quick demo
Yep.
of it, and then we'll go to
So here's the model that we have. It's all just in Excel. This is the example we just looked at.
so make that like 1.5 or something down there. Well, no, I meant the 1.5 million.
Oh, so 0.7. Well, what did I do?
One, and it doesn't.
Yeah, so 1.5.
And then make the other one like 2 million down there, and maybe the top rate 2 or something, and just let it trickle through.
Yeah.
My point being here is that no matter you can change any variable in this model and it'll trickle across. It takes it a little while because it's a big spreadsheet, but it'll work any variable.
Yeah, we can set those to whatever the committee would like to investigate. As Representative Jones said, this does take a little bit. While that's thinking, I will just show some of the output that is available that should be posted online. So here is the output for the particular scenario that we walked through. There's the map that was on this PowerPoint. Here are the median values, which I imagine are pretty hard to read, but they're there, so you can take a look at those. Here's the average values homes instead of the median. And then here are those summary statistics statewide at the top, and then every county is listed down below. So those are there for you to look at. The scenarios are also there. So again, the statewide is the first page, and then each county is listed on the subsequent pages. And here's that scenario that we just talked about. If you increase the cap for $1 million or $1.5 million for primary residence and 1.4 and 2 for commercial properties, you would see an overall decrease in general fund and state university revenue of 17.5 million. And here's what that breakout would be at the different types of properties. So residential improvements would see an overall decrease in taxable value of almost $300 million, decrease in taxes of $126 million. Same with residential improvements, or excuse me, rental improvements. So a decrease of 127 million in taxable value and 52 million. And that would be made up primarily by the all other residential category, which would see an increase in taxes of 152 million. And again, this map here now reflects those alternate scenarios. There's the median home value impacts, the mean or average home impacts, and then the county summaries.
So I guess a couple comments and we'll talk questions here. I believe this model has some real merit. It will never be completely perfect, right? Because each county or taxable jurisdiction is unique. But if you have a bottom rate of around 1.1, The owner dwellings and rentals that get a 1.1 rate are going to have about a 20% reduction in property tax. You'd have to fuel that by some number higher, probably 1.8, 1.85 or something, to bring in enough money to cover it. If you have a bottom rate on commercial around 1.5 and a top rate maybe 2 or 2.2, you probably could make both of those scenarios work out. You know, obviously in the perfect world, you could get it so there's no mill transfer at all, but the world's never completely perfect. So, but when you look at the fact and you look at these charts, even with this change, which we just randomly made here, and you look at the decrease in residential owner dwellings, which is small on my screen, but it was 100 million on the last one, if I remember right. And you know, you're moving enough dollars that the amount you're impacting the owner dwellings is real. There is going to be some pushbacks, right? Because you're always going to be impacting. It's never perfect, and you're going to impact each county slightly different. However, if it is indeed our goal to say that owner dwellings and long-term rentals deserve a favorable rate, then this does provide the funding to do so. You know, there's a number of discussions about, I've heard a number of things like, well, the big residences already pay enough money to cover the services provided them. Well, it's never been a direct correlation. How many services does a pipeline consume, yet it pays a certain tax rate as well. So ultimately, if we are looking to say that we want to have some of the out-of-state impact who does not pay property tax, who does not pay income tax in Montana, help with the impacts that they have somewhat generated by such a large level of move-in, at least in my mind, this model has some merit. Those are, I guess, my comments, questions, thoughts, discussions.
Hi.
Cindy.
Thank you. Thanks, Eric and Representative Jones. My question is, when you looked at the impact on agriculture in your scenarios, did it include every single classification of land?
It did. So again, we weren't necessarily changing the taxable value of any of the agricultural properties. So their values, their taxable values, would be the same under current law and under the proposed law. However, when we change the taxable values for some of the other classes of property, that can have the effect of changing the overall mill values, which will affect all properties, including agricultural land.
Okay.
And I would suppose, Eric, that's going to really depend on the mix of the classes from county to county.
Correct. So that'll depend on what share agricultural makes up of the overall tax base.
Okay, thanks.
Well, and interestingly enough, when you look at the eastern 40% of Montana that did not see the significant amount of market value increase, it also probably doesn't have as many high valued homes. So it's strangely self-correcting, because where there's high valued homes, they saw massive market value increase, but that also fuels the money to buy down or impact the other classes. At first blush, I was very, very pleased with the output of this model. We now just have to try to narrow in on where we're going, recognizing that wherever you go, you're going to feel some angst. Senator Hertz.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I too agree. I think this has got lots of potential here. Eric, obviously you estimated the impact on the median and average primary resident. Did you calculate the impact on a non-primary resident? Something that we could look at so that we can kind of see what would the shift be?
Senator Hertz, I have not done that. I think that is something we could probably work up without too much difficulty. So we have the median values. Home, we could just look at what the difference would be between that being a primary residence and that being a vacation home. Would that be kind of what you're looking for?
Yeah, maybe we don't even need that, because I guess if you just look at current law, although there's going to be a shift because the rate's going to go up.
Mhm.
So yeah, it would be more than current laws tax. Yeah, obviously you're gonna have a shift upwards. I think we just all need to be prepared and recognize what that shift is gonna look like and how big it is. And I don't know if you can do something like that on commercial also, just kind of get an idea as to maybe a larger commercial building that might be 4 million, 5 million versus the one that's going to get a Comstead exemption. They're going to get part of it. Everybody's in a, on the commercial side, but what will the shift be and how large will it be?
DJ, I think you got your hand up.
Yeah, I just had a quick question of classification of the residential other who's taking a burden off of the home sites. Being that there are Montanans that have maybe a legacy property that's been in the family for a long time, would that residential other capture those legacy properties in the different jurisdictions?
Yeah, presumably that would be in the other category. The primary home sites that we used to estimate all of this was based on the properties that received a rebate for their primary residence, the $675 rebate specifically. And presumably those legacy homes did not receive a rebate, and so they would not be included in these calculations, if that makes sense.
Now, some of the lakeside homes, for example, that property tax, and I don't know, was 17 or 19, we did some work to help those folks that had long-term properties alongside the lake on at least the land portion. You remember what year that was, Senator Hertz?
Yeah, I believe it was 2017, and it's the legacy. It has to be 30 years in your family, mother, father, sister, daughters, reaching out, and then the value of the land cannot exceed 150% the value of the improvements. So let's say you have an old log, an older building that might be only worth $300,000. Use an example, Whitefish Lake, but now your lot you're sitting on is worth $6 million, $5 million. With the legacy exemption, it's only going to be worth 150% of the value of the improvements. So I think that's something we may need to look at. That do we need to drop that 30 years down to 25? Or I think there's other, we can look at that to kind of help out some of those legacy properties too going forward.
Yeah, especially if this happened. Ralph, you had your hand up.
Yes, Eric, to Senator Hertz's first question. So a second home or a non-permanent resident owning a home, wouldn't their tax change by the percentage change roughly of that residential other group? So you could just apply that percentage change to represent the shift in the bottom right of the.
That would be a quick and dirty way to do it. Yeah. So as you can see under this scenario, all other residential property would see an increase in their overall taxes of 35% statewide. It would be 37% in Beaverhead County. So whatever it was, you would multiply that by 1.37, and that would be one way to estimate that.
Rhonda? If you're talking, you're still muted.
There we go. Sorry about that. I was just going to point out the same thing that Ralph just did, that I think that I believe the answer to Senator Hertz's question is under other residential and large commercial. The shift that goes to other residential should be second homes. It should be the ranch house that's in the ranch, in the company, anything that's in a trust. It should be all those homes should fall under other residential, I think. And then if we give the same deduction to all commercial for the flat bottom, like we do with the business equipment tax, then the shift on the large should show what the difference would be to our bigger commercials after that deduction.
Yeah, that seems to make sense. So additional comments or thoughts? Okay, so all these slides are. Oh, somebody just put in slide up. Sorry, I was trying to read a message, a chat that popped up. So in our subcommittee, you know, I think our next step for us is to try to come up with a number that's a balance of what's politically possible and what still provides enough income to actually make a meaningful change for owner dwellings and long-term rentals. Obviously you'll never get it perfect. There's going to be a county by county variance, and whomever the variance hits is going to not be pleased, right? The problem with squishing the balloon anywhere is it squishes out somewhere else. I do think, however, that the vast majority of the voices that most of us are hearing from are Montana owner dwellings and smaller businesses. That's who we hear the loudest voices from. They're certainly the folks that are in the largest numbers. And so it seems like this certainly has merit to take to the next step. It is where I find myself at. And so I guess comments or thoughts on that?
I guess, Lou, in your mind, what are the next steps? How are you going to refine this model? Are you going to refine it down to a certain number of scenarios, or?
Yes, that is what I've been thinking about. The challenge we have is, one, I'd want it to be dynamic in time. And so when we're looking at right now, we're just typing numbers in 500,000 or 1.5 million. I would want to come up with a methodology so that number moved. And so my thought would be, and I'd want to take a look at, because the median home in the Gallatin is going to be double the median home every statewide. So we're going to have the base number, something like maybe 3 times the median home in the state, so that it gives, or 4 times. Same on the commercial, come up with a dynamic number, and then try to generate sufficient income so there's not a lot of out of area shift. I think at 1.0, we're going to have the top. My personal opinion is, and I'm willing to listen to folks on it. So at 1.1% on the bottom rate, it was about a 20% property taxpayer long-term discount appeared to be the number before. At 1, it's 25%. I'm going to think we're going to have to keep my thought is a discount of around 20%. And then the top number, so it reduces the pain of the transfer somewhere else, 1.1 or even 1.5 of 15%, some number such as that. The commercial I haven't quite made as much peace with. Those charts and the new lines you added to those charts certainly add value, Eric. They weren't there when we first looked at them, where the crossing occurs. I very much like those lines. But yeah, I think we got to hammer it down to a number of scenarios. I'm certainly interested in hearing from folks on that. I do think when you look at the amount of income, given that, my vice chair, and he can speak for himself. Oh, is your hand up? No, you just got that's your chamber hand. My vice chair, Todd O'Hare, made a mention in our very first meeting of managing to where the puck is moving. And so unless there's something drastic we're missing, the destination move-in demand will continue. It's likely that the out-of-state ownership of Montana homes will continue, that the tourist impacts will continue and potentially grow. And so where the puck is moving in a state without a sales tax, now the local option work of Senator Hertz may change this some, but in a state that doesn't have a statewide sales tax, this would ensure that some of our out-of-state ownership does participate at a higher level. I think that's important. I also think we're going to have to try to correlate with the work that's being done on the 95 mil section, in particular the 587 dial. Because if, for instance, the number we set brings in another 25 or 30 million on the 95 mils, we potentially want to ensure that money is returned into the property taxpayer in some manner. That's kind of where I'm heading unless someone's got a better idea.
Further comments or questions? And I'll kind of open it up. I mean, if there's anything that you guys have thought of as you've gone through these subcommittees, I'm just kind of open it up to the floor. Is there anything that you guys want to touch on that we haven't or have questions? Yeah, Cindy.
This is Cindy Johnson again. Representative Jones and Eric, there's a concern about large corporate ownership of many residential rental properties. Has that been a consideration in any of your scenarios?
Out-of-state ownership of large commercial properties.
Of commercial rental properties. And that's what's driving higher rents or basically lack of availability also, because corporate ownership of single family dwellings too has increased.
Yeah, the short-term rentals in particular. Well, this would catch the short-term rentals. The long-term rentals, technically, those folks would be paying in-state income tax as well. But I don't know how you would touch that, right? Because it's not illegal to own a commercial building in another state. Or, you know, and we are going to be limited by, in all of the work we do on the Constitution, on equal, on fair taxation. You know, and here we're doing that by saying everybody's paying a higher residential rate, but if you just happen to be an owner dwelling, you get a homestead exemption in a percentage manner. But that's, you know, about the.
Wasn't there some, Lou, didn't we do some work at one point on long-term versus short-term rentals?
Yes. Well, that would be captured in this model, right? Once we've gotten that done, that the long-term rental would get the reduced rate, the short-term rental would not.
The other, that would be the other,
Yes.
Okay.
So,
Todd, I see you got your hand up, unless you want to go on there, Lou.
go on. No, I saw Todd's hand just as you did too, Todd.
Right. Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Just a couple of points. One to Cindy Johnson's point is that we're starting to see more and more larger businesses wanting to get into the business of providing workforce housing for their employees. And so, right, I think that's something we want to encourage. And so I don't know that we want to get into a situation of discouraging those folks as they look to address their own workforce shortages. And so we're starting to see more and more of that. And another thing that I would just raise, I think it was during Senator Hertz's presentation when they were talking about e-tax. The Montana Chamber of Commerce in 2019, prior to the start of the COVID, we did a sales tax, property tax, income tax, scientific poll to gauge the interest of voters with regard to a sales tax, and you know, with it offsetting income tax or property tax, and no surprise, right? Widespread, wide demographic, largely wide political opposition to a sales tax. We conducted that exact same poll again in late 2023 in an effort to try to see, it's like, has the needle moved? The only reason I bring this is that one of the interesting components that I found anyway that came as a result of that poll was we specifically asked the question on the e-commerce, like, you know, would you be supportive of a tax, a sales tax on e-commerce? And that was one of the most visceral sort of reactions that we got from voters. There's like, no, right? We don't want e-commerce tax. So it's an interesting dichotomy that we have, where it's like, you know, there's sympathy towards property tax payers and businesses that are having to pay property tax, but a real reluctance when you start talking about taxing someone's
Amazon or online purchases into the state of Montana. And so I just throw that out there is that, you know, some of these sort of solutions, there is a political feasibility to it and a political reality that we have to take into consideration. And just wanted to raise that, is that was one of those issues that really registered the strongest in opposition to was a tax on e-commerce, which I kind of thought would be a no-brainer, but that goes to show you how aligned I am with a large part of voter sentiment in the state of Montana. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Commissioner Holmquist. Pam, did you have a question?
Yeah, I do. Actually, it's more of a comment, you know.
Sure.
I think these have been really good discussions. I've learned a lot, and I think we're talking, of course, about a very complex issue, as we all know. But I think we need to keep in mind as we talk about shifting and moving things around and changing bases, we got to kind of remember that the main increase in taxes usually comes from voted levies, which we have no control over. If you compare Montana to other states, you know, our taxes, people may gripe about them, but they're fairly reasonable if you look at other states with sales tax compared to ours, which we don't have a sales tax, and so our property taxes are actually pretty reasonable when you look at that, I believe. So just some comments, just thoughts. I know we're gonna look at some other options here, and I think that's good. But that's just some thoughts. Thanks.
Yeah. Any other thoughts? Questions? Go ahead, Senator Hertz, did you have something?
Yeah, so Eric, all these shifts are within a taxing jurisdiction. Isn't that correct? Other than maybe centrally assessed, which is a little bit harder to define that shift, since essentially assessed property jumps across county lines.
Senator Hertz, yeah, so the shifts, I mean, are gonna happen within all the various taxing jurisdictions across the state, right? So as some property becomes more valuable, they will, or a larger share of their taxable value, their overall tax burden will grow. And if their taxable value shrinks essentially relative to the overall tax burden, then their tax burden will shift, and that'll vary depending on which particular taxing jurisdictions you happen to be in. Not sure if that answers your question, but this might try.
Yeah, it does. I mean, I was more of the centrally assessed stuff. It's a little more complicated on how that even.
Yeah, I mean, the centrally assessed stuff fundamentally gets allocated to the specific levy districts that are unique combination of taxing jurisdictions. So we know what those were, at least for 2023 rather. And those shifts are what they are given the centrally assessed share of the overall tax burden.
I mean, I think, Greg, I think the question you're asking is, I mean, if you used a hypothetical, if you said that, you know, if you had a county that was predominantly, you know, not a lot of larger homes, and you had, you know, the main base was centrally assessed, and if you drop that rate, and obviously, you know, your central assessed is going to go up, but if it remains the same at 135, let's say, it would be the same. It wouldn't make any difference, right? And so it just depends on what rate you're going to use for that base rate, more than anything, just like it would be in agriculture.
Right. And then I assume, Chair Jones, I know you talked about this at your committee, but obviously the implementation of something like this, I think the Department of Revenue is digging down into that and kind of to see what issues they might have in implementing something like this.
Yeah, so my thought process obviously is going to be that we're not asking the questions now that are going to allow us to see this perfectly clearly. For example, as you pointed out, we're saying that you have to live somewhere for 7 months to be considered an owner dwelling, but there's some questions we're going to have to ask, right? I assume if we're going to define short-term rental as less than 30 days, And so there's going to have to be, are you a long-term or short-term rental? And, you know, because we're going to have to, under this definition, with the understanding that you may be checked up upon, you know, there'd have to be some enforcement teeth. So yeah, there's going to be some efforts needed, because obviously we don't have, we aren't doing this now. So the methodology to put it in place doesn't exist now. And in my mind, it might take a transition year. Potentially there may need to be something like a rebate for one more year while the department transitions to something this complex. But again, those are all devils in the details. But yes, how would we do this? How would we move from the best of guesses on data, which is what we're doing now, to accurate data? And then certainly I would see, once you claim or you prove up on an owner dwelling, it'd be more like the PTAP programs. You wouldn't be doing it every year. It would be an owner dwelling till it's sold or something changed, right? So that, because we want it to be easy for the property taxpayers to act upon it. But yeah, there's going to be, and I'm sure the department can weigh in, there's going to be some thought processes. How do you enact this sort of an item? And I do think if we're going to make these decisions, if we are on a destination path to be somewhat Hawaii-like in certain portions of the state, and we appear to be, then some of these decisions probably need to be made earlier than later, or the stream in the land is going to increase. You know, it's we really only have two funding sources, and we're going to have to figure out how to best manage them. So, Eric, your thoughts on, or whoever wants to speak for the department? Obviously, we're going to have to look into how to best implement. It's going to take.
Yeah, I would just say that we haven't really started down that path. You know, it sounds to me like you're thinking this is a policy that you would like to pursue more. So I think that'll be part of the next steps, right? Is thinking about what the options are for some of those questions that you had. How do we define short-term rentals? How do we verify that we're going to classify those in the right manner? And we'll continue to look at those as we move forward, is kind of my thoughts. I believe I saw Bryce Kotz and Robin Rood online as well. So I don't know if they have anything to add to that. I would defer to their expertise on that manner. But it will likely take some additional costs to implement a program such as this.
Representative Jones, this is Ryan Evans with the budget office. Yeah, I think Eric hit it exactly on the head. And I maybe go back to another plug for the templates here, one of which the key categories we'll be asking you guys for are key strategies, and that being, what are the next steps necessary to implement? And so with the report being due in August, as you know, and as many folks know, the governor will be proposing a budget November. So certainly there'll be a couple bites at the apple. I mean, one, obviously you got to see if the juice is worth the squeeze, right, on the admin side, but that will be certainly a step in anything that we would propose, certainly as part of the governor's budget. And I would assume anything that we would likely include even as recommendations to the governor. So I think those cost assumptions, to the extent that there will be, whether they're state or local foreign costs, we will try to at least describe, if not acknowledge, what they are in that ultimate report. So yeah, I think the short answer is yes. We will look at those.
So as part of our next step, we probably need to begin to hold those conversations.
Yeah, and you're probably right. And a lot of it will come back down to just what would otherwise be kind of an informal fiscal note process. Are there IT changes? Are there more resources? What does enforcement look like? You know, because it's ultimately, what's the size of the box? Is it a $1 million investment of administration of this? Yeah. Or is it 50 million? I think probably closer to the former, but yeah, I think it's 100% trying to figure out how big that bread box is.
I like, what is the juice worth the squeeze? That's a good way to put it.
Well, I think that's kind of in a way, that's kind of what you guys are doing in your subcommittees, right? I mean, there's lots of ideas out there, and you hear, even when you talk to constituents, that, well, if you just did this, or if you just did that, sometimes when you go down those paths, you realize that either it doesn't make enough difference, or it's not making the change that's desired. It sounds good. And so that's the reason, and Dwayne and I were just talking about that before. I mean, this is a bit of a slow process, and it's meant to be because, you know, we want to vet all these ideas and make sure that they're actually valid and they do what we want them to. So with that, is there anything else? I mean, as far as subcommittees, chairs, do you guys need anything else from us? Is it going fine? I know you guys are you still have more data requests information requests. Are you guys good?
I'm fine. I mean, these guys are doing great work for me, and so I'm happy with that. It's kind of laid out the direction we need to go again, right? We're gonna continue to begin to look at implementation costs and try to maybe narrow in on a target number. Obviously, the legislature, because the model exists, can play with those, you know, or the exec to whatever number they want, but try to come up with something realistic and say, this is our best guess of where we should start. And this would be the cost of implementation.
Yeah, this is Rep. Bedey here. Director Osmundson, I think things are going well, and I really appreciate the work being done by both legislative staff and executive staff on this particular project. Probably the one thing that I would be interested in knowing is, as we look at Eric's model and the work we're doing here, I'd just like to understand what kind of a time horizon we should be looking for in terms of any modeling effort that we do. It may be sufficient that we're just looking 1 year out. I don't want to spend an awful lot of time trying to you know, run a 4 to 6 to 8 year projections if our considerations are going to be just for, say, 2 years. So that's one thing, some advice to be given. That way I can narrow the scope of some of the work being done by staff and thus save some of the time.
That might change a little bit, Representative, based on, you know, the information we have and how far out. I mean, obviously the longer projection is always best, but sometimes that vision is only so far. So that'll probably depend on the, you know, each individual request, I would say.
Except Director Osmundson, except that as I had mentioned earlier, I'm going to be attempting to you know, run some or merge some of the work we're doing with the work that Eric's doing, and that it may be that I can embed most of what we're doing right in his modeling. So I don't know. We can have a talk about this offline. I just want to make sure, because you know, the time is winding up, as Ryan told us here earlier, faster than it seems. I want to not do any unnecessary work and focus only on the most essential things.
That's fair.
And Representative Bedey, really quickly to that point, this is Ryan again. You know, at least Director Osmundson and I were talking very briefly. There could be a couple of items here, and I think you just started identifying a couple where, if we need to coordinate a joint subcommittee effort, you know, I think those are the options: either a joint subcommittee, or if it's enough value, or if it's a formal enough recommendation, you can bring it certainly back to the full committee. But there could be an instance where tax fairness and schools are, you know, there's going to be two topics that we really need to, on a subcommittee basis, pour into. So that's something, straight to your point, to be more efficient with all staff time. I think that's something we definitely entertain.
Thank you.
Sure. Good. Yeah. Mendenhall.
Scott Mendenhall with Department of Revenue. It sort of looks like we're narrowing in on some things, and if you would like, we could begin to put together the team in Department of Revenue to sort of put together a fiscal analysis or administrative analysis to ballpark some of these things.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Is there any other business? We're going to go on to public comment if I don't have anything from the committee. Any other committee business we need to take care of first? Okay.
So, Mr. Chairman,
Yeah.
I think there is the other web that just got posted. I think it was just a tax bill demonstration too. Is that correct, Eric?
Yeah.
I think it'll be somewhat brief, but I think that was the last item. That this was the second version.
Oh, I have the old one.
Third version.
Okay. Yep. All right. Yeah. Go ahead, Eric, if you don't mind. Go ahead and
All right.
explain what it is. And
Yeah. So now that we've been talking about tax shifts, I just thought this is a great example to think about some of the analysis we presented a little earlier on in this process. So here is some things that are important to think about when you're looking at your tax bill. As I mentioned earlier, your overall property tax bill can be thought of as not just one tax bill, but a separate tax bill for each taxing jurisdiction that your property resides in. So if you think about, what's important there, you're going to need to know the overall taxable value of that taxing jurisdiction, and then how large of a share a particular property composes of that overall tax base, and then ultimately how much those taxing jurisdictions decide to levy will correspond to what your property share is of that overall tax base. So here is an example that I just wanted to go over very quickly. This is a property in Flathead County. So this is the 2022 value, and then down here we have 2023 values. So to look at this analysis, I thought it was kind of interesting. This particular property appreciated in value by approximately 38%. However, most of the taxing jurisdictions that this property is in grew by more than 38%, generally in the neighborhood of 45 to 50%. So that means even though there was great appreciation for this particular property, the overall tax burden for this property would have fallen, all else being equal. And so that's kind of what is displayed here. So if you compare these numbers and these numbers, you can see that change. So this is the overall change in the share of the total tax base that this property represents. But it's also important to consider the total amount of revenue being collected. So here is the amount for each of these taxing jurisdictions, and here's the growth from 2022 to 2023. So here's what the overall taxes are for those particular jurisdictions. So overall, you can see this property, even though the value went up 38.15%, the overall taxes only went up 6.61% because of the growth in the other property in those taxing jurisdictions. This analysis also breaks out the tax shift. So the tax shift would assume that these taxing jurisdictions levied the same amount of dollars as they did in the previous period. So if that had been the case, you can see this property would have seen a decrease in taxes for most of the taxing jurisdictions, because again, this property's share of the overall tax base went down. So those range, they're presented here in absolute terms and percentage terms right here. But overall, they would have decreased generally from 5% to 7%. The one exception to this is the state mills. As I said, this property appreciated by 38%, but the overall tax base for the entire state grew by 29%. So this property's share of the overall tax burden grew on a statewide basis, and you can see those numbers reflected here. So if you look at this overall increase, like I said, $215, there would have been a $125 decrease if all the taxing jurisdictions levied the same amount of dollars, but they didn't. So there was actually an increase of $341 because the taxing jurisdictions levied more revenue. This is one example. As I said, we can look at a different example real quick just to see how this compares. So here's a geocode for another property. This is in the city of Helena. This is a bit different. So this property appreciated by 57%, but the overall tax basis grew by 25 to 30% or so. So this property's share of the overall tax burden grew. In addition, the total taxes for these taxing jurisdictions also grew at that same time. So that was kind of a double whammy, whereas in the other example, they were canceling each other out. Here, they were adding to each other. So this property's taxes increased $880. $536 was because of a tax shift. Again, this property became more valuable relative to the overall tax base. And $304 were because the taxing jurisdictions ultimately levied additional revenue. And here are those numbers in percentage terms. So I just wanted to remind everyone that this is out there. And
we don't have that available online yet, do we?
We do not. It's my understanding that we are working towards that, or
Yep.
by we, I
I think
mean,
I'd like to get, at some point, it may not be quite ready, but that would be, I think at some point, good to have where folks can type in their own address. Because I think that's just a great tool that you put together for the fact that it helps people understand that it's just sometimes the jurisdictional shift is real. So, yeah, it's not all counties are the same, not all jurisdictions are the same. So.
agreed. And like I said, the overall value is one small piece. It really, the important piece is what your value represents of the overall tax base. So.
Okay, we'll have to take your word for it because here in this room, we don't see the spreadsheet very well, so.
Apologies.
Yeah, it's not your fault. Okay, are there any other questions from the committee? Comments? Okay. Yeah, we'll go on to public comment now. Yeah, so I don't know, I see we have a couple people in the room, and if they have anything to say or otherwise, just here to listen, so.
My name is Jeannie Rhodes and I live in the Bonner area of Missoula. And I own a manufactured home and I rent the land. I qualify for the property tax assistance and I get 80% off because I have no income, because they look at your Social Security as zero and your taxes for income. However, my landlord does not gifted with that. And his taxes went up from roughly $1,000 to $40,000. I don't see how that happened, but anyway, my taxes have gone up over 50%. I mean, my rent has gone up over 50%. So is there some way that the tax assistance program could be used to help with the rent going up on the people that live in this particular trailer court? Only it's not a trailer court. None of these houses are trailers. There's no axles, there's no wheels, there's nothing under them except bricks. There's no solid foundations because that changes the whole whatever. So you can't rent them on a solid foundation. But is that a possibility? That's the only thing I'm asking. Is it a possibility that that could cover the fact that I would get 80% of what he's charging me for taxes? I wouldn't get it. But off of my rent, that would come. Am I making sense that that could come off of the rent? So is there some, I don't know if that has to change the law or if that's something that administratively could be changed. Because you're looking at this piece of property is getting double taxed. It's getting taxed for the land and then I'm getting taxed for the house, but they're not being put together. So it seems like they should be put together so that the renters, especially the elderly people, the low income people, most of the people that are where I live are working people. But I counted it up, I think there's 6 of us in there that will be on Social Security. And I mean, I'm looking at it, I'm surviving this year. If that happens to him again, and they came through taking pictures, and we know that probably they're going to raise the value of the property. And he said he has had, what is it, Blackstone, is that the name of the big money people? Anyway, he said, I get a call every week of people trying to buy this property. He owns 3 different properties in there. His dad started building them. And he said, we built this for our retirement. We built this for families. We want to keep it like it is. And I just looked him in the eye and I said, and when they come along and offer you $100 million, are you going to sell? I live on the Blackfoot River where they put in the Milltown Park. We're right before you get to the park. And the river's my backyard and I'm on the high side, no floodplain problems there. My insurance doubled. He said his insurance doubled. Of course, everybody's power went up. We understand that, but it's just, I'm looking at, I'm going to lose my home. And I know a lot of other elderly people that live in these homes. One of them in Missoula, the lot rent has gone up to $1,000 a month. And the lady that lives in there, one of my friends that lives in there, she's 92. And she said, what was said to me was, well, just sell your house and move. And she said, I'm 92. I don't have any family. I can't move. I physically could not do that. So I just want you to realize that there's tens of thousands of us people in Montana that live in this situation, and please don't let them make us lose our homes because of the taxes that we can't get help with because we don't own the land. So
if I could just ask you a question, are you eligible for the rebate at all through, because it sounds like a unique situation because it's not a trailer, but it's a modular.
It's a
So, I mean,
modular home.
that makes it a little bit different too.
right,
I mean,
I did get, okay, because I get 80% off my taxes. Well, before they went up, okay, last year there was 155 and I got what I paid and I got the 155 back. Now it's gone up to 220. So that means the tax on my house has gone up to where it's $1,000. But I will put in for that and probably get that back. But
yeah,
the
it's
rent's
the
what-
land that's the problem.
yeah, the rent's what's killing me on the land.
No, I was curious, because years ago, when my wife and I first got married, we lived in a trailer and it was taxed differently. So that's why I just asked how that.
Yeah, I
at
didn't
that
think I
time,
would
so.
qualify because isn't that considered personal property? I don't know. I don't know what the definition. But I didn't think I would qualify, and I got a letter from the governor and I filled it out and sent it back and I got the check for $155. But I think I would have been eligible for the 650
If the land.
yeah, if it was on the land. So one piece of property is being double taxed, or I don't know if that's the right definition, but that's what I feel like there's, like I said, I know there's tens of thousands of us in the state of Montana that are looking at this, and I feel that we are forgotten, that you haven't looked at that piece of property to realize what's happening to your older, I'm old enough to be the mother of every one of you and grandmother of probably some of you in here, because I'm well into my 80s. So I'm trying to speak up for this population of the people in this state.
Well, I appreciate it because I think it's a unique situation, because a lot of times the home is owned by the land and the homeowner, and so that's taxed the same, whereas in your case, it is very different. So I think that's a unique situation, so.
Right.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
that's my request today is don't forget us.
Yeah, I appreciate you bringing it up.
Thank you.
Is there further public comment?
Well, I wasn't gonna come again, but then I got my extra tax bill, because we're in Beaver County, McGivney held back on that loss for us, so we all lost anyway. And then I hear what the governor was up to with his taxes. And so here I am again. And then I read a comment, researching all this by Dan Bucks, former revenue director, that the system is rigged and broken, and it certainly is broken. I won't get into the argument about the rigged part, except on part of what's happened to us. So I just wonder, are you looking at backing off on the appraisal values? Because they are so inflated, they are wrong. I guess some of the building materials have actually come down in price, and they need to back off several years of the appraisal values. That's what's killing us all. And
Could you, just one second, could you state your name again? I don't.
oh, sorry, Art Mangles, in Glen. I'm a retired farmer, mostly retired, and we exchanged into property on the Big Hole River. We have a Big Hole River retreat, and we have 3 cabins in the event center. We rent out to fishermen, wedding parties and reunions or whatever, and we try to keep it low income so families can enjoy it. But the way taxes are going on us, they're killing us, so we're going to have to sell out, most likely. And that another problem is when we exchange out of the farm, we're like a lot of farms and ranches. You have a corporation or an LLC, and the son or daughter's house is sitting on the property too, and it's all under one name. And so now we got 2 houses there. We only get the exemption on 1 house, and that's another problem that needs to be addressed. I think maybe you touched on it somewhat. And let's see. Oh yeah, the other issue I mentioned, the Gainey Foundation and 2 Moose Camp. It's across the river in Madison County, just behind Glen. I don't know if you know where Glen is. It's just a narrow spot in the road off I-15, 3.5 miles south of the exit. And have you looked into that? These big corporations are coming in, or foundations owning a lot of land, and then they write it off. That's called a church camp. And they use it just a couple of weeks out of here, from what I hear, for that. And then they rent it out for weddings, which compete with us. I think I told you that before, but I'll remind you again. So I hope you look into those problems. Then we get to the governor's 11.4 acres. He really stepped in it this time. As a retired bona fide lifetime Montana farmer, we lost our ag exemption on 69 acres of our 71 acres. 2 acres is commercial. That's I understand that. That's fine for that business. But because of the increased AUM rules from, I don't know, it was 23 to 25 or something, they kicked us out. We showed enough grazing to qualify, but some little technicality they used, some factor, kicked us out. And a hotshot analyst named Mr. Billman here, I don't know, he's in this department somewhere. I called him on it, and he says, well, according to the Google map, he was looking on a map or the phone, he says, you've got too much willows in one area, you got too much of this and that, and you don't have enough grass. Well, I went back to the DNRCS office in Dillon, and they said I do have enough grass, and I had, I think it was 30 AUMs. Some of it's cattails, some of it's sagebrush. There's a lot of grass, and it's also a floodplain. I think I mentioned that before. But there's grass in a floodplain, and we treated 30 head deer and moose. Plus, I had livestock on there. And we did make $1,500 off of it. And now we're trying to fence more of it so I can graze more by keeping them off the river and low water so they don't get onto the freeway. And but that all takes money to do that too. And I noticed that Newville family out of Bozeman, next door to the governor, they mentioned that it's going to cost them a lot of money to tear out brush to get more production. You know, you're between a rock and a hard spot on this stuff. And anyway, when I appealed to the county on this issue in January, and the Department of Revenue showed up in full force at the appeal like hungry vultures and to intimidate us and the committee. So we were denied over a little technicality. Here the governor gets, got a ground, mine's dry land, but I got 69 acres of dry land. He's got 11.4 acres. You look on the Google map, he's not all that's in crop. Much of it's a big home and roadways and some trees. So I don't know, maybe 6, 7 acres of that is in crop. Plus he's, it says he's feeding horses and mules or something. Well, I had one of the revenue people in Butte tell me, oh, horses don't qualify, they're a hobby. Well, down in our area, horses are used for work. That's cow country. And then I had another lady who wants to bring her horses there, and she's using them for therapy horses for veterans and disabled people. So there's little quirks that are just killing us on all this crap. And
Art, if I could paraphrase just so I understand what you're saying, is you've lost your ag exemption.
Right.
Okay. And so I think and you've said you've gone through the appeal process.
I went through the county appeal, but I didn't take it to the state appeal because I figured I wouldn't win. The way they treated us there, I knew I wouldn't win.
Could you provide us with some very specific details in terms of what they told you, why you lost your ag exemption? I mean, we have another committee, another task force that's actually looking at ag valuations and how they should be evaluated. It sounds like that would be something that they could take a look at.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering. We can reopen this case in lieu of what the governor's got away with.
Well, I would be careful of what you say there because you probably lack a lot of details, Art. Because I know more than you do. And the reality of it is I've been there and he does have an ag operation there that he leases out to people, and they actually do production agriculture. So
On that 11 acres?
it's more than that. And the reality of it is that the newspapers don't really report half of it. And so you should know that. And so I would hesitate to go point fingers at someone else. But if you have a legitimate concern, and if there's a legitimate case here, then we want to know about it. And if there's something that you didn't get treated fairly, we want to know about that too. And if there's something we can change, we want to be able to, but we do need specific details on it.
Yeah. Well, I guess we would,
That'd be great.
better to get it all together.
Yes.
The problem is, now the time's elapsed. We only got 30 days after that appeal letter, and I think that comes to me the end of January. So you got so many hoops and hurdles to go through to appeal anything. I found that out. A lot of people that wanted to appeal, and they found out they were too late to do it.
Okay. Well, if you can provide me with some details, I would appreciate that. If you've got a write-up or if you've got something that I can go off of, that'd be great.
Well, when this guy told me I didn't know much about grazing, and anyway, quiet, I thought, well, that's funny. I've got a degree in plant and soil science from MSU. I've got many credits from range management ag econ, not to mention 60 years of experience and many years on a county soil conservation district board. So I wasn't going to mention that, but it just ticked me off their attitude. So they need to clean house. And we've contributed immensely to the state's economy, hired up to 12 people yearly on our farming operations, and we're trying to provide reasonable lodging for families and wedding venues and so on. And also some of our lands in the floodplain, which alleviates downstream flood pressure. I don't know if I mentioned that before. And then these rebates, it's just a one size fits all that he's throwing at us, that like us people that have a family member with a home on the same property, we get screwed. We don't get that. And then the rebates don't cover the higher taxes. Let's see.
Give a timeline you can provide to me, Art, in terms of what happened when, and just not right now, but can you provide that for me so we can look into that? I'd appreciate that.
Yeah, because that was the end of January when I got that denial letter, local.
Okay.
And so, like I said, the time has lapsed because I gave up on it. But the more I look into this, the more I see you've got problems. The system is broken. That's for sure.
Well, and to be honest with you, that's why we're here. We're here to talk about solutions. And so if there are some
of it, you guys have got your hands full just to listen to all this, but there's some of these issues I wonder really they need to be looked into further, like backing off the trailer rise and then these big foundations coming in, flying up and calling it a church or a nonprofit. I'm not talking about smaller nonprofits. Some of them might start attacking some of the small ones, like my brother's museum there at Folsom, but they're not the problem. It's these big corporations. Okay, thank you.
Yep, thank you, Art. Is there further public comment in the room? I do see we have one online. So. Okay. Mr. Story.
Thank you. I'm going to start at the back and work toward the front of the meeting, I guess, since it's easier on your minds probably. I thought it was interesting on the last model, Bob Story, Montana Taxpayers Association. The last model Eric showed you about the levy districts and what was going on in there and how what caused people's taxes to increase. And the probably the largest percentage of most of their increases was because the 95 mills didn't float down. That statewide levy, that was, $100, $200 on a lot of those people's property. So, a couple of questions I
believe that was on one of them, Bob, just to be fair, not all of them.
Yeah, it was significant, but anyway, on Eric's general model on looking at Homestead and Comsteads, I think unless you really fine tune it, the 95 mills are going to probably always collect less money than they do currently, because you're taking so much money out of the residential class 4 tax base, and the shift you're getting back on the non-owner occupied is partly due to tax rate, but partly due also to mill levy increases. And so since the 95 can't increase, and it does show up on the analysis page. I didn't realize that till probably the last one you ran, but I think in a lot of cases, especially when you break it down to the county and city levy levels, school district levels, you're going to have less collections on the 95 mills in most cases, unless you balance a thing to be revenue neutral on a statewide basis, and then you're going to lose a lot of your advantage that you're trying to get. Which brings to the next point, and I think if Eric and Representative Bedey start working together on the school funding, tying it into that, I think you're going to have some GTB costs shifts in this thing too, as you take money out of the tax base with the residential property reductions. And so you might have to look at that number also. This would be another complication to the analysis, but a lot of the places that have big increases, it's as much to do with the land as it is to do with the improvements. And I don't know how complicated it would be, or if even you want to go there to look at separating the land and the improvements and dealing with them differently at tax rates or not, but or exemption, maybe the exemption side, but that might be something that would smooth things out, or might not. But it's a great model. I guess the real issue you want to discuss, or policy wise, is whether homestead exemptions are a good tax policy or not. You know, once you put them in, you're not going to get them back, and there's probably always going to be pressure to raise them all the time. And again, that's residential property is what drives the cost of schools and cities and county governments. And if the pressure is out there to keep raising the exemption as values go up, try to hold the impacts down on those properties, you're going to have to shift it to other properties, absent another source of revenue. And I don't know how much capacity you have to shift it to out-of-state people. I think a lot of that shift is going to be to Montanans who own second homes or recreational properties and that type of thing. So that's really the main policy decision, I guess. Is it a good tax policy to start down the road of exempting homes, portion of a homestead value? I think on the House Bill 587 discussion, which gets back to, again, shifting, not creating money, just collecting money and shifting it from one place to another. You're going to, the countywide equalization concept, I guess what I'm getting at is basically you're going to probably shift money from the rural portions of the county to the urban portions of the county, just because that's where the kids and the teachers are. And so as you go back to a countywide equalization system, which was really what was in place prior to 1989 with the 29, 331 and 333 sections of law. Again, you're going to just be moving money around, and some people will pay less in taxes and some will pay more in taxes. And it's just, I guess, who's going to get the benefit of that. And again, I think that benefit will generally fall to residential property owners inside of cities at the expense of non-residential property owners and folks who live outside of the cities. So all of those equalization things, whether it's statewide equalization or countywide equalization for retirement or countywide equalization for base funding, is just shifting money from one taxpayer, increasing one person's taxes so you can reduce another person's taxes. And I think at some point in time that could be analyzed, but I don't know if it's worth analyzing because of the complexity of it. And then again, it's really a political decision at some point, is whether, who's got the votes to get a tax decrease at somebody else's expense. But anyway, I think there's a lot of good work going on here, and I just amazed at the work that staff, both in DOR and legislative branch, are doing in building these models and putting things together so you can do this complex analysis, and be interesting to see where this all shakes out. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. All right, I don't see any other public comment. Bob made a good point. I want to thank the staff. This has been a tremendous lift. And so from my office, DOR, you guys have done great. I really appreciate it. You've got obviously ways to go yet, but it's good work. We'll get there.
LFT too.
And LFT, that's right. Yep. They've also been doing great work. So I appreciate everybody sticking around here, late meeting. We're way past schedule, but good stuff. Yeah, Scott.
Mr. Chair, just wanted to address and I appreciated Mr. Mangles being here again and your input and being involved in the process. I just want to make it very clear that I'm not sure about how it was when Dan Bucks was the director, but we do operate our Department of Revenue on a week basis. Everybody's treated the same. I don't know how it was when he was there. So the assertion that the governor got special treatment, it's absolutely categorically false.
Well, we certainly got some difference in our assessor views. They tell me different things.
Right.
The laws are not that complicated, they look into that section, subsection. So
that's why we're studying this. And that's why we have the line classification working group looking at who gets ag value and who doesn't. But the assertion that the governor got a special deal by our administration is false. Just want to be clear about that.
You're right. I'm a long hair. My grandparents came on 1910. I know other things about it. Second cousin was visiting years ago, so I just wonder.
Okay, we're gonna go ahead and close this meeting out. I really do appreciate everybody taking time to be here and all the work you guys are doing. So
Next meeting?
we haven't had that discussion yet, Cindy, but that is a really good point. We've got to look at the schedule and see when we try to schedule it to some extent around some legislative meetings that are going on. And as you can see, we're in a different room today, and that's because I didn't schedule it with the room down there. So I will do that next time. So, but we will be in touch very shortly on that. So, figure about 30 days out will be roughly when we'll do it. We want to give the subcommittees plenty of time to meet.
Okay.
So. Okay, with that, we are adjourned.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much.